Morning. Welcome to the final session of the All Church Book Read. Thanks to all who participated, taking time out of your schedule to engage this moving and thought-provoking work by James Baldwin. I want to especially thank the discussion leaders. I'm so grateful for the way you've stepped in to lead what we knew would be a challenging but important conversation. For those of you tuned in via the live stream, we're glad you're here. I'll try to keep an eye on the live stream chat for your questions for our speaker. And for the All Church Book Read participants who are on this Zoom call, we're eager to hear from you. Please keep yourself muted during our speaker's lecture. And to further reduce confusion, please do not have your live stream sound on while you are participating in the Zoom call. You may enter questions into the chat at any time, but once Dr. Finch is ready to take your comments and questions, I'll ask you to use the raise hand feature on Zoom or to actually raise your hand, and then I'll call on you in the order I see you. One thing to note is that for those of you on the Zoom call, we can all see each other's faces, but the live stream camera won't pick up on your face unless you're speaking. So you can relax when you're not speaking and know that the live stream isn't able to see you. We're so eager to hear from Megan Finch. Dr. Finch is an assistant professor of English at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, teaching courses on American literature broadly, African-American literature, and dystopian fiction. Her work appears or is forthcoming in Self and Cultural Critique. Her research focuses on the relationship between Enlightenment, racial slavery era discourses on reason, idiocy, and Blackness. Megan is currently teaching a graduate course on James Baldwin's novels at the U of M and revising an essay that offers new insight into Baldwin's third novel, Another Country. Thank you so much for being here, Megan.
I am happy to be here, and thank you for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as I have a PowerPoint. I'm utilizing PowerPoint largely for organizational purposes and for quotations. So some of them will, some of the slides will be fairly text heavy, and that's largely just to give you the full quotation as I go in and out of them. So I'm going to do that now. And given some of the kind of sharing constraints here, I'm going to kind of leave this in outside of presentation mode, just because I prefer to be able to see some of the functionality of Zoom that I can't normally see otherwise. So the title of today's talk is Blackness in and Out of Time, Baldwin After Civil Rights, Before Bars, Following Fame, and Out of Time. And what I want to do here is to think about the ways in which Baldwin is both, this novel is both timely, but revises many of the kind of age-old, at least as far as Baldwin's corpus is concerned, concerns, as well as thinking about some of the possibilities of being out of time within this novel. In particular, the ways in which this novel maybe speaks to more contemporary narratives about living and being otherwise, outside of kind of temporalities that mediate our capitalist society. So I want to begin then with Baldwin in time. So on the reception of If Beale Street Could Talk and the Decline narrative. So Beale Street Could Talk, If Beale Street Could Talk is Baldwin's fifth novel. And it is the third novel in what is oftentimes described as, and contested by scholars, as a decline narrative. So after The Fire Next Time, many people understood, and many still do understand Baldwin to have been exhausted. And that exhaustion being a creative exhaustion, which has significant impacts on his novels after, the novels that come after, which are the final three novels, Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, If Beale Street Could Talk, and Just Above My Head. So the reception of If Beale Street Could Talk is always caught within this particular narrative. And probably, or what many of you I'm sure noticed, is some of the difficulties of the kind of narrative perspective within this text. Right? There are moments where perhaps Tish is not there, and yet somehow we have a very full account of what's happened. So on the one hand, this novel is within that narrative. Was also fairly poorly received. And the poor reception had a lot to do, I think, with two very different readings of the novel. One was that Baldwin was not responding at all to the present moment, right? So thinking about this as after the peak of the Black Power movement, and that this novel doesn't respond to that at all. So that's something that, for instance, Joyce Carol Oates wrote about in her reception of this novel. On the other hand, people during this period, both in this novel, Just Above My Head, and Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, suggests that Baldwin pays too much attention to this new moment, right? That these novels are much angrier and they're much more political, and that he's lost some of the craft of his work as a novelist. And so what I want to do then is to actually go back to an earlier text, and I'll start with one reason to go back to this first text, and then hopefully it will become clear most explicitly why we actually do want to start with Go Tell It on the Mountain, Baldwin's first novel, to think about what's going on in this novel. So Go Tell It on the Mountain is Baldwin's first novel, which is semi-autobiographical, or really largely autobiographical. And in it, Baldwin is thinking about Black masculinity, Black religion, Black politics through the 1950s. And so the novel is published in 1953. And Baldwin here is suggesting, and I would argue generally, and this is something that we can certainly talk about, that Baldwin's novels are generally about the problem of Black masculinity in a white supremacist and anti-Black world. And even this novel, which is ostensibly foregrounds the voice of a young woman, I think is actually still very much engaged in this question. And so if we begin here then with this theme of that begins in Go Tell on the Mountain, Baldwin's first novel, we have this relationship being constructed between Black masculinity, Black religion, Black politics. So one of the things that this novel suggests is that religious institutions are a site in which Black masculinity is performed, oftentimes though, or is performed but not necessarily actually found. So one of the things that is happening within this novel, it begins in the present time of the novel, we're in the North, but the novel when it goes backwards begins in, or has moments where it talks about slavery and then moves to the Jim Crow South. And so I want to kind of take a look at this passage here that describes how the institution of religion kind of comes in relationship to political agency. So this quote, and actually it's slightly covered by the Zoom controls here, so I'm going to close out a little bit. Yet she told her children God was just, and he struck no people without first giving many warnings. And this is an enslaved woman who's saying this about the end of slavery. God gave men time, but all the times were in his hand. And one day, the time to forsake evil and do good would all be finished. Then only the whirlwind, death riding on the whirlwind, awaited those people who had forgotten God. In all the days that she was growing up, signs failed not, but none heeded. Slave done rise was whispered in the cabin and at the master's gates. Slaves in another country had fired the master's house and fields and dashed their children to death against a stone. Another slave in hell, Bathsheba might say one morning, shooing the pickaninnies away from the great porch. A slave has killed his master or his overseer, and he had gone down hell to pay for it. So I'm going to end that quote here. And what we can notice about what's happening here is that the belief in religion makes the belief in kind of institutionalized forms of religion makes this slave refuse to take action, refuse to believe that acting is a good thing, right? So here we have this notion that juxtaposes a belief in a kind of the movement of, or the kind of necessary progress that is a promise versus kind of taking action for oneself. After enslavement, the main character, who is the son of one of the figures that is discussed during this period, gives a speech that's very similar and makes us think about the relationship between this moment and the burgeoning civil rights movement. So while this novel was published in 1953, and we normally think of 1954 as the beginning of the modern civil rights movement, thinking about Brown versus the Board of Education, as well as the murder of Emmett Till, of course, one of the things other narratives of that period suggest that it is in the wake of World War II. So Black men returning and refusing to be called boy at the end of that, at the end of having fought for their country. So at this moment, Gabriel, who is one of the primary characters in this novel, says, and he's giving a sermon at this moment, and for if we but wait humbly before him, he will speak glad tidings to our soul. If we but wait, our change will come, that in an instant, in the twinkling of an eye, we will be changed one day from this corruption into incorruptibility forever, caught up with him beyond the clouds. And these are the tidings we now must bear to all the nations. Another son of David was hung from a tree, and he who knows not the meaning of that tumult shall be damned forever in hell. So one of the things that's happening here is with the kind of violent reaction to the return of Black men after the Second World War, that Baldwin is suggesting that institutionalized religion has the function of kind of offering some notion of control to Black men during this moment, but that it is in place of meaningful political action. Right. So Gabriel here and throughout the text is Gabriel, who's largely the figure of critique in the text, and or is what the text is being critical of, rather. And in this case, it is his kind of putting his faith into institutional religion as opposed to political action that becomes kind of the kind of significant way in which that triangulation of Black masculinity, politics, and politics is functioning. So what I also want to suggest here is that the other element, which becomes important as we think about If Beale Street Could Talk, is the way that whiteness shows up within this text as well. So one of the things that is less possible in Jim Crow South, but becomes possible in the American North, is the question of the white world, right? The power, the wealth that Black people did not have access to. So as we move to the present in this text, we have the other primary character, the John Grimes, who's actually the primary focalizer. And one of the things, I'm just going to read a small passage from here, which isn't on the screen. And he's talking about the white world that he sees on Fifth Avenue. So they had closets full of whiskey and wine, they had cars, but what church did they go to? And would he teach his children what they gathered around him when they gathered around him in the evening? He looked straight ahead down Fifth Avenue, where graceful women in fur coats walked looking into the windows. They held silk dresses and watches and rings. What church did they go to? And what were their homes like in the evening when they took off their coats and their silk dresses and put their jewelry in boxes and leaned back in soft beds to think for a moment before they slept of the day gone by. Okay, so here we also have one other thing that's important here, which again is important to If Beale Street Could Talk, is this notion that in all cases the white world is largely outside of within this the Black church's construction that Baldwin is particularly interested in is outside of salvation, right? So what he's interested in is the idea that one of the way that Black masculinity and the Black church function is to give Black men a place in which they actually can perform a kind of some possibility of hierarchical position, right? So while the white world may have political power and wealth, they've lost their soul, right? Their capacity to believe and participate meaningfully in spirituality. And this is all of these kind of brought together, something I'm suggesting that Baldwin is kind of critical of within this text. One of the things that is also within this text and is largely frustrated in the 1950s for Baldwin is the possibility of being otherwise. And here we get to, I think, the most important way in which Go Tell on the Mountain speaks to If Beale Street Could Talk. So if that is the main character who is largely a stand-in for Baldwin himself, if that is the paternal line, his mother her story really begins for us in the North. And one of the things that she is engaged with her fiance, and He's not religious. He doesn't have a particular plan for how he's going to be in the world, but he spends a lot of time reading, and all he wants to kind of have, he wants to have a life in the world. And it's not clear what that's going to look like to him or to her, but there's this desire not to be, both not to be religious, but also not to be kind of beaten down by the white world. However, and this is where we can see the connection with Beale Street, he's arrested for a crime he didn't commit. So I'm going to read these passages here which should remind us of the opening of Beale Street. Again, I'm going to close. But Richard was not sent away. Against the testimony of 3 robbers and her own testimony, and under oath, the shopkeeper's indecision, there was no evidence on which to convict him. The courtroom seemed to feel, with some complacency and some disappointment, that it was his great good luck to be let off so easily. They went immediately to his room, and there, she was never all her life long to forget it. He threw himself face downward on his bed and wept. She had only seen one other man weep before, her father, and it had not been like this. She touched him, but he did not stop. Her own tears fell on his dirty, uncombed hair. She tried to hold him, but for a long while, he would not be held. His body was like iron. She could find no softness in it. She sat curled like a frightened child on the edge of the bed, her hands on his back, waiting for the storm to pass over. It was then that she decided not to tell him yet about the child. So as we can see here, we have a similar story. While Richard is charged with robbery and Fonny is charged with rape, we have a similar situation where we have a Black man who has been in prison, in this case he's now out of prison, and a woman who is pregnant with his child. So she decides at this moment not to tell him about the child. And here's the result of that in the subsequent line. So by and by he called her name, and then he turned and she held him against her breast while he sighed and shook. He fell asleep at last, clinging to her as though he was going down into the water for the last time. And it was the last time. That night he cut his wrists with his razors, and he was found in the morning by his landlady, his eyes staring upward with no light, dead among the scarlet sheets. Right, so here we have the consequences for Baldwin of her not telling him that he had been pregnant, or that she had been pregnant, right, and that they were going to have a child. And she oftentimes thinks about, and this is key to how Tish is being narrated, how her power in keeping this baby alive is so central, right? Because Baldwin is suggesting here, and suggests elsewhere in this text, that knowing that he would be a father, or that he would have been a father, might have been something that would have kind of given him the strength to continue. And that's something that haunts Elizabeth as well, Elizabeth being the female character here. So I'm suggesting then that fairly clearly Baldwin's If Beale Street Could Talk is taking this up in a new context, right? So insofar as there's oftentimes, as I mentioned before, this decline narrative, or this sense of that Baldwin is either refusing to think about the present, or has been thinking about in terms of the Black Power movement, or is thinking about it too much. I'm suggesting that what Baldwin is actually doing here is taking this moment that he's been so interested in, both this particular moment, and also this question of the relationship between Black masculinity, Black politics, and Black religion, and thinking about how that shifts after the Black Power movement, right? So in the 1950s held a certain amount of possibility. This character as a possibility otherwise, a possibility of kind of living within this world, is one that kind of is fundamentally frustrated here. And frustrated is a kind of very mild term for saying that it ends in the suicide of this character. However, the possibilities here are very different in the 1970s. And so Baldwin, picking up on his own themes, in addition to responding to the present moment and some of the critiques of the Black Power movement, or movements, I should really say, is improvising and rethinking this. Right, so keeping time, I'm kind of now moving on to keeping time after Black Power. So we're visiting prisoners, unwed mothers, and Black families. So of course, as we've all read, we have this opening moment in the text where Tish has gone to see Fonny, and she's explained how their names are kind of interesting improvisations on the names that they were given. And I just want to kind of suggest or like note the way that Baldwin is, I think, really thinking through a jazz praxis here, right? This idea of improvisation and things that unexpected turns. And so this moment in the text, again, occurs on page 4 to 5. And this should be consistent in both in this edition as well as in the Kindle edition. You see, I know him. He's very proud and he worries a lot. And when I think about it, I know he doesn't. That's the biggest reason he's in jail. He worries too much already. I don't want him to worry about me. In fact, I don't want to say what I have to say, but I knew I had to say it. He had to know. And I thought too, that when he got over being worried, when he was lying by himself at night, when he was all by himself in the very deepest parts of himself, maybe, when he thought about it, he'd be glad. And that might help him. I said, Alonzo, we're going to have a baby. Right, so here we have, so again, to kind of bring this all together, my suggestion here is that this is a way of redoing this moment now that we have characters who have a different sense of what it means to be Black in the contemporary, right? So I think, so to kind of push back on Joyce Carol Oates's suggestion that this text isn't responsive to the Black Power movement, I wonder if she did not read the Black fist that kind of keeps coming up. Right, Baldwin is very clearly invoking in more subtle ways than explicit that these characters are unlike earlier characters, have a kind of political agency, a sense of self that did not exist in the 1950s when Baldwin begins writing Go Tell the Mountain, and during which it's published. So two of the, I think, most important innovations that are happening at this moment that Baldwin is picking up on are the figures of, to kind of return to this, the prisoner and the unwed mother. Right. So up until this moment, or up until the 1960s, the Black prisoner is a site of embarrassment for the Black family, right? And once we have narratives like Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice, or Soledad Brother, or most explicitly, I think, the autobiography of Malcolm X, we begin to see the prisoner as an important site of not only Black politics, but Black masculinity as well, right? This notion that one of the things that was often said about in poetry, as well as writing about Malcolm X, was that he was our manhood. And I think that that's important to kind of be able to come back to this moment, to come to writing a prison narrative from the outside, so before the bars as opposed to behind it, and thinking about being able to have a character who we can fully invest in as readers, who is also a prisoner. Right? That's a key innovation of this period. The other part of it, and here's where this quote comes in, is the figure of the unwed mother. And to go back, even further than Baldwin, to think about W.E.B. Du Bois and his notions of his description of double consciousness. The two figures that largely plagued Black politics for Du Bois are these two figures, I think, of the criminal and the criminal / prisoner, which I think become bifurcated in this moment, and also the unwed mother. And instead of, and that of course carries them through to the religious institution that is foregrounded in Go Tell Them the Mountain. One of the kind of tragic outcomes of the suicide that I just discussed is that the Elizabeth, the woman who's pregnant, they're unmarried. And so she is deeply ashamed, right? She has nowhere to go. She can't tell anyone about what's happened. She has to marry very quickly in order to kind of hide what she understands to be the shame of having had premarital sex, and having that then be broadcast in the fact that she now has a child. Right? So what happens then as we move to the 1970s, and we have a very different Black family that has a very different relationship to religion. We have Tish's mother saying, "Now listen," she said, "you got enough on your mind without worrying about being a bad girl and all that jive ass shit. I sure hope I raised you better than that. If you was a bad girl, you wouldn't be sitting on the bed. You'd long be turning tricks for the warden. And you and Fonny be together right now, married or not, wasn't for that same damn white man. So let me tell you what you're going to do. You got to think about that baby. You got to hold on to that baby. Don't care what else happens or don't happen. You got to do that. Can't nobody else do that for you. And the rest of us, well, we're going to hold on to you, and we're going to get Fonny out. Don't you worry. I know it's hard, but don't you worry. And that baby be the best thing that ever happened to Fonny. He needs that baby. It's going to give him a whole lot of courage." So not only does this again repeat the significance of having told Fonny and the significance for Fonny of this baby's existence, it's also this significant shift in terms of a family, a supportive family, and thus a family that really moves outside of for Baldwin institutional religion. Right. So his description here, or the description of this family, is that they're Baptist and they go to church every once in a while. But they're contrasted, of course, with Fonny's family, right? And particularly the women in Fonny's life, who are very religious. And the shift that's also happening with this text, that they're as opposed to whiteness being outside of Black religion, here they are coded within this text as being half white, or being kind of in love with the white world. Right? So there's a shift here, I'm suggesting, between Baldwin's old notion of the relationship between whiteness and Black religion, which was that Black religion is a way for Black men of having power in relationship to white power structures. In this case, instead of having a Black male who is the kind of primary figure of religion, we now have 3 Black women, right? And there are no Black men in this text, or no central Black men in this text who are actually invested in religion. Fonny's not, Fonny's father is not, and neither is any of Tish's family, right? And that suggests that one of the critiques that Baldwin is making here, which is in line with the contemporary moment, is rethinking Black religion and the relationship between Black religion and Christianity in particular, and thinking about thinking about whiteness here. Right? So we have this retriangulation, or this rethinking of this set of relationships. So I actually want to kind of stop there for a second before I move on to what is perhaps most interesting to me about this, and see if there are any questions that have come in, or any questions that anyone has about what I've said, or clarifications I can make, and of course pushback too, before I move to what I think is this description of time out on progress narratives.
All right. I don't see any questions in the chat immediately, but are there any others any questions now? You can raise your hand using the Zoom feature, or I will look for your hand and you can call on me that way as well. It'll take me just a moment to scroll through here to make sure there aren't any. Oh, I see Mark. Thank you.
I'm going to stop sharing for a second just to allow us to.
Great. Mark, you'd have to unmute yourself and then go ahead and ask your question.
I'm unmuted. Very curious your comments about religion, and indeed Tish's family was fairly superficially religious, but it struck me that they were Abyssinian Baptists, and I recalled Adam Clayton Powell being the central figure in that church in Harlem at that time, who was, of course, very engaged politically. Could there be a sense in which they had picked up on the spirit of the Abyssinian Baptist Church by becoming more secularized and political?
I think that Baldwin's critique is probably less, at least I read Baldwin's critique as being less pitched toward a more general audience. And I think his critique is largely of institutionalized religion writ large. And I say that in part because I think that what we see with the raised fist, I think what we see with some other things that are being signified in that text, a a more explicitly political kind of in line with the Black Panthers and other political groups during that period. But I that's not to suggest that so that's kind of how I read it, but that's not to say that I think that that's accurate.
I see Tim Kelly's hand raised. Tim, you'll have to unmute yourself, please.
Megan, I have a variation of that question that last week, and thinking about your comments then, was Fonny's family then, because I think you said that their religious orientation was, maybe it was from last week, was a little bit superficial. They did all the right things, but they weren't there for him. And are they then a metaphor for what you were saying of whiteness and the white church?
I think that it's less metaphorical and a little bit more explicit, right? So they are both they're all light-skinned, right? And that's part of it. And there's a particular notion of beauty that Baldwin is working against here that has to do with kind of coding them as the mother as having once been beautiful and the daughters at the very least being kind of half white, or and even their father as being kind of lighter skinned. So I think that the connection to whiteness is less metaphorical and more actually explicit in this way, if that makes sense. That they actually are, like he's suggesting that they are actually, that they have this investment in whiteness that has to do with skin color, as well as I think also kind of synecdochally with their way of conceiving of Blackness that doesn't perform a certain, so their feelings about Fonny and his, what they understand to be his kind of being somewhat of a deviant. And I'm not saying he is a deviant, but that's how they conceive of him. And that has a lot to do, I think, with notions of respectability, right? And that idea around respectability being also something that Baldwin at this time is associating with whiteness, right? Which is happening within, if we read poems about not just poems, but other works of literature during the Black Power, Black Arts period, right? We have a lot of this description of respectability as being, and the civil rights movement in general, actually, as being indebted to white money and kind of white notions of self.
Thank you. Jackie's hand is also raised, and while she's unmuting herself, I'm just going to read a comment from the chat. Dwayne is saying, thanks for giving us so well a bigger context of the situation of Baldwin's novel. This adds weight and import to our all-church book read. Jackie, thank you.
Megan, thank you so much for your comments. I really appreciate you putting this novel in the broader context of Baldwin's unfolding vision. In our discussion group last week, we got into a conversation about the novel versus the film version of the novel. And what I especially appreciated you talking about was the way in which Baldwin in this novel is depicting the prison experience. So looking at it from outside, but not with shame, with a sense of, injustice. So he shifted that narrative from his 1950s writing. But if you jump from this 1970s to the way in which the film version of this novel depicts that experience, we talked a lot about the ending. So at the ending, Fonny does not get out. He stays in prison. And so we talked about why would the filmmakers in 2018 change that ending? I'm wondering if you have some comments on that and how that depicts yet another evolution of the way in which prison figures into the Black male experience.
Yeah, so I'm going to be perfectly honest here and say I have actually not watched the movie. The movie came out just after I taught Beale Street for the first time. And I remember being very excited to watch it, and I just never did. And I really debated, like, I should watch it before this, but I also find it kind of tends to color my my thinking, which is, I think, true. Yeah, so on the one hand, I'll say that.
The book is better.
What, the book's better?
Yes.
Okay.
Except it's the novel does stay fairly close to the book, in some ways almost word for word, until the end.
So the end actually is, so there's the last thing that I want to kind of talk about, and maybe I think that my stance on this might, or maybe I can revisit this at the very end, just to, because what I'm interested in is thinking about what happens in terms of time in the novel. So if so far what I've been talking about is this notion of Baldwin in time, like in relationship to various historical moments and kind of these configurations of politics. I think that the novel, though, has, and that Fani at a certain point where he's actually kind of improvising on Tish's understanding of time, that actually what happens is that time, that there's a further evolution to this. There's a further kind of way from shame to injustice, that there's also, or from shame to kind of thinking about prison itself as not being shameful, but needing to be innocent is still an important component, I think, within Fani's understanding, right? He has to be innocent for us to feel this way, right? And this is in picking up also with what had happened in Go Tell on the Mountain. I'm suggesting that when Fani learns that I'll be repeating this in a few minutes too, but that when Fani learns that his date has been postponed and he lets go of hope, or he doesn't, I think the specific words, and I'll look at them in a few minutes, but he kind of doesn't abandon hope, but he kind of stops clinging to it. That we get a moment where, and then that changes his relationship to being in prison. That what's happening there is actually a kind of way of thinking about the embrace of the criminal as well, right? So not just the embrace of the prisoner, but the criminal, and like within this context, and that to me kind of and then the possibility of always already as a Black man being within this system, and always kind of awaiting the potential capture, and that in that way the ending makes me think about, or the ending of the movie makes me think that I feel like for me that feels okay, in part because I feel as though it really, the getting out or the not getting out is something that happens in time. But that Baldwin, I think with that shift in Fani and with a few other things that I'll talk about, that Baldwin is really interested in Blackness being out of time, kind of potentially. And I don't mean out of time as in having no time left, but out of time as in being kind of out of these temporal kind of progression logic. So 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. The policeman is always waiting, right? So to think about the police officer and the entire system, like that's always there to capture and to arrest. Both arrest as in stop and arrest as in arrest Black life.
I do have one more question from the chat. I know you have a bit more teaching to do, so I'll let you go into that after this question perhaps. And then I just wanted to mention, I did have a disruption in my internet connection, which kicked me off of the call. Megan, you are automatically the host, I believe, in that case, but Jackie, who just asked the question, has agreed to be the co-host. In case I'm kicked off, she can help you with the questions, calling on folks and grabbing the questions from the chat. So just as a matter of precaution. Kathleen asks, can you talk about Fani's accuser? Are we to end up feeling only sympathy for her?
Kathleen, are you thinking about, when you say only sympathy, are you thinking about kind of that we don't feel anything more for her, or whether we feel sympathy for her at all, or maybe both of them?
No, I mean that we feel nothing other than sympathy for her.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to hear actually maybe what other people think. I don't feel much other than sympathy for her. I think that to me is the primary, what's primarily being mobilized there, which I guess also means I don't feel like the text wants us to feel contemptuous of her, right? It's already kind of offered as there are two options, right? One is that she becomes another person, and that's what it would take to admit that Fonny hadn't raped her, or she goes mad, right? So these are already kind of set up before they go to Puerto Rico as possibilities. And yeah, I do read her with a lot of sympathy. And I think that also has to do with a broader question about sympathy, the sympathy between Tish's mother, Mrs. Hunt, and Puerto Rico, right? So there are moments where, and this is something that I'll also kind of bring up a little bit later, but there's a way in which Baldwin is also making a critique of US imperialism and by this. However, of course, I think if sympathy is all that's mobilized, right, that there isn't a sense of agency here, we might be somewhat kind of critical of that as the kind of soul that Mrs. Hunt has to then mobilize this relationship, to see the relationship between Puerto Rico and her own position, and also that kind of sympathy can be limited, right? It's a limited form, or it's maybe not at all an agency.
Megan had asked if anyone else had thoughts on that. Does anyone else have a comment or sensibility about how we feel about Fonny's accuser? I don't see any hands. Thank you.
Great, so I'm gonna then go to the kind of final portion of what I'm thinking about here. And I do wanna suggest, as I would suggest in any kind of context in which I'm thinking, is that this shouldn't totalize your understanding of the novel, right? I have my reading of the novel, which comes from my own particular kind of disciplinary interests and my own kind of broader interest in this field. But that of course, is not necessarily in line with what everyone thinks about this novel, and shouldn't kind of colonize your thoughts on it either. So let me go back to sharing my screen or my keynote and get to this kind of final portion. So here I am thinking now about time out on progress narratives and being out of time. Right? So one of the things that I've thus far thought about is the progress narrative from enslaved, and Baldwin's thinking on this, from enslavement to the kind of civil rights, pre-civil rights moment, and now into the Black Power movement and movements. And I want to kind of suggest that the novel is also improvising in it, and here we can think about, again, Baldwin's interest in jazz, is kind of improvising on this as well. So here I want to think about this moment in the text. This is 94-95. Tish is in the attorney's office, and they need to buy some time. And this is what she thinks narrates. Time, let me close this again. Time, the word tolled like the bells of a church. Fonny was doing time. In 6 months' time, our baby would be here. Somewhere in time, Fonny and I had met. Somewhere in time, we had loved. Somewhere, no longer in time, but now totally at time's mercy, we loved. Somewhere in time, Fonny paced a prison cell, his hair growing nappier and nappier. Somewhere in time, he stroked his chin, itching for a shave. Somewhere in time, he scratched his armpits, aching for a bath. Somewhere in time, he looked about him, knowing that he was being lied to in time, with the connivance of time. In another time, he had feared life. Now he feared death. Somewhere in time. He awoke every morning with Tish on his eyelids and fell asleep every night with Tish tormenting his navel. He lived now in time with the roar and the stink and the beauty and horror of innumerable men. And he had been dropped into this inferno in the twinkling of an eye. So what I want to note here is the way that time progresses, and the way that all of our lives might be understood in terms of progressive time, right? That we meet, have go to college, if we do, get married, if we do, and have children, if we do, and die, if we do. All of these things are like the kind of traditional plottings of a life. And what I then want to note in relationship to that is that moment of being out of time, right? So being not only when one is out of time at the moment of death, at least, maybe in this context, although obviously there are other questions about what comes after that, but somewhere that moment, and this is on the third to fourth line, somewhere no longer in time, but now totally at times mercy, right? We loved, somewhere no longer in time, but now totally at times mercy. And I want to suggest that that their love that is happening no longer in time, no longer within this imploded time, is actually significant to what Baldwin is thinking. This idea of what happens outside of time, what happens outside of the implotment of a life, what also happens outside of the implotment of politics in relationship to shifting notions of rights and power. So I want to then shift to what I think Fani is doing with this, right? So this is a moment where Tish is having these thoughts and they overwhelm her, right? She's, at this moment, she's, she starts crying just after this. And at a later point, a little bit later in the text, so actually kind of near to the end, when Fani learned that the trial had been postponed and learned what effects Victoria's disaster may have on his own, right? So Victoria's having had the baby and gone mad, it is I who tell him something quite strange, altogether wonderful happens in him. It's not that he gives up hope, but that he ceases clinging to it. And what I want to suggest here is that one way we can think about hope is also within kind of teleological time, and that clinging to it is clinging to this notion of I'm going to be out of prison at some time, right? That in time I'm going to get out of this inferno that is outside of time, and I'll begin my life again. Right? I'll begin my progress towards from enslavement, to kind of put this again, or to kind of connect this to the larger trajectory of Black politics. I'll be out of prison slavery and move then to Black power. But here, and it's coded here, it's described as strange and altogether wonderful to stop clinging to that narrative, right? It's not to give up the possibility or the desire to be out of prison, of course, but it also is to no longer cling to that as a sign, as being a part of an imploded life or political trajectory. What happens after this is, and I'm sorry, this is very small type given how much there is here, but on the subsequent page, we see what Fani does with this, right? So when he goes back to the prison, here's what happens. So now Fani knows why he is here, why he is where he is. Now he dares to look around him. He is not here for anything he has done. He has always known that, but now he knows it with a difference. At meals, in showers, up and down the stairs, in the evenings, just before everyone is locked in again, he looks at the others, he listens. What have they done? Not much. To do much is to have the power to place these people where they are and keep them where they are. These captive men are the hidden price for the hidden lie. The righteous must be able to locate the damned. To do much is to have the power and the necessity to dictate to the damned. So I'm going to stop reading there and just kind of say a little bit about what I view as happening here. Okay, so in relationship to what I had said earlier in response to a question, what I think is happening at this moment, or how we might read this moment, is that Fani has come in with knowing that he didn't do anything wrong, and that has separated him from the experience of other prisoners, of the life and possibilities of talking to other inmates, right? I don't belong here, and is the stance we might see him taking. And that in that stance, it makes difficult kind of looking around and kind of understanding and listening to other people's stories, right? So now with this difference, at meals, at showers, he listens. What had they done? Not much, right? So he's putting himself in conversation with and in relationship to people who had done something, right? Not much, but something, right? So, and the question here then, to locate himself in relationship to the two inmates or two prisoners who are also, criminals or who've committed crime, is to also place the critique at a different level, right? The critique is no longer the critique of false imprisonment, but of a system that creates the necessity for crime, and a system that that enables people to create spaces like this inferno, and of course, then in relation to that, the Sahara where Tish finds herself. And so I think that this then, to speak to the end of If Beale Street Could Talk, the film, suggests that Black life is lived in this captivity either way, right? I think that one of the ways that we might read what's happening is that when Fani ceases to make a distinction between his own predicament of not having committed a crime and the predicament of those who have committed a crime, that he is kind of suggesting that the system that places them there really doesn't make much of a distinction between them either, right? And that there's in time, that this is always or that thinking about Blackness in time is also maybe in some ways to forget the ways in which Blackness is always kind of potentially out of time, is always potentially, and this is to go to an earlier quote from what I had said, is always, or what Baldwin has said, is always, and actually let me go back to it quickly just so I can, you can be dropped in this inferno in the twinkling of an eye, right? That's always a possibility here. So what I wanted to kind of finally end with, and I think actually we don't have much time, so I'll just kind of read this here, and if people have immediate questions, I can talk about those. We can talk about those too. But that I'm suggesting then that the novel is actually interested in, and is most interesting to me, in the possibilities that are out of time, right? That occur not as part of this progress narrative, not as part of the the raised fist. And I think it's worth noting that the last time that Tish leaves Fani, he salutes her, right? They've been using the fist has been important up until then, and we know the kind of political significance of that. But the final time they meet, he actually salutes her. I'm not sure what to do with the salute as a kind of maybe historical, what that might have meant historically, but I do think it's kind of a way of suggesting that Baldwin feels he's improvising and perhaps moving beyond kind of the Black power logics. So what I was hoping that people would do, and I don't think we'll have time here, but in your small groups or with yourself, consider how the following offer potential sites of affiliation and modes of being beyond linear progress, outside of profit motives, and across racial lines. And how are these moments placed outside of the forward progression of the plot? Right, so thinking about the Spanish restaurant where Fani has, where he's makes a whole life and relationships with people, and they lose Tish's bill, right? And this doesn't have anything really to do with the kind of progress narrative of Blackness, right? There's no real connection to that in that way. However, something is happening there that doesn't really fit into, I think, these linear progress motives. Arnold Hayward, the lawyer, for instance, the moments where where the trial is being where the trial has been postponed, which is of course itself a non-linear progress, are the moments at which, and is the moment in which he realizes how much he cares about Fani, right? He didn't take the case because he cared initially, but in those moments where he's most frustrated, where the profit motive is probably the least because it's taking so much of his time, and of course at a cross-racial affiliation, right? Where, where we have, of course, the racist white cop and racist DA, but Baldwin isn't content to kind of simply bifurcate along racial lines here. Levy, the character who was going to rent to Tish and Fani, right? This has no impact on the plot in a certain way, other than it's the thing that it hoped to get them away from the white cop. But he has their deposit, and he says he'd give it back at any time if the film is correct in its reading of 3 years later, right? That has no real impact on the progression of the plot, of the kind of get a house and kind of move on in this way. However, and is outside of a profit motive and is across racial identity lines. However, it really kind of suggests, I think, these possibilities that don't again occur within that linear time. And then there's these two discussions of Mrs. Hunt, particularly on her thinking about solidarity with Puerto Rico and on her discussion of music, which I think is a really kind of interesting and one that we can see Baldwin, the importance of music and its relationship to subjectivity and to kind of how to inhabit, particularly through spirituals, I think, how to inhabit kind of certain relationships to spiritual relationships that go beyond religion. So I think that really does it for my time today, and I really appreciated the conversation. I'd love to continue it with anyone. I'm easy to find on the UMN website, and I'll stick around here also for the group that's on Zoom. But thank you so much for inviting me today and for giving me the occasion to rethink this novel.
Thank you so much for being here. We're really grateful for your expertise and the perspectives you've offered. We have just maybe 2 more minutes for one or two people to offer some final reflection on the question that Megan asked, and then I'll just make a few announcements before the live stream kicks us off at 10:15. So did anyone have any immediate reflections on Megan's question? I see Jackie's hand.
So Megan, while you were talking about the end and the discussion of time, which is really fantastic, it does mute a little the ending, the last section, which is called Zion. So it's a really different reading of what a Zion is, or what Baldwin is imagining it to be. I'm wondering if you could just say a word about his use of that word, Zion.
To be honest, I think I would have to think a little bit about it, and in part, more than I have. I think in part my reading is also, if I'm being totally honest, this novel is a little difficult in certain ways. I do think that that it has some serious flaws, and the heteronormativity, which is present in this novel and not really in any other novels, and is one that my reading is really attempting to, I think, recover some ways that don't kind of link Zion with the birth of a child and with and with the getting out of prison, when Baldwin, of course, knows, and when we know now that getting out of prison is part of a linear progress that it's difficult to kind of totally believe it. I'm not believe in, of course, one can be in and out of prison in a very concrete way, but of course, as we have kind of daily proof of, Black life is imperiled in many different ways. So I do think that I have blunted that reading in favor of this, in favor of thinking about the possibilities otherwise. And I think that, however, thinking them in relationship to each other is probably the best, right? That thinking about Zion and how it, and how that adheres in that final passage, alongside some of perhaps the counter work or the queerer work that Baldwin is also doing, is probably the best way of getting at the novel. So thank you actually for kind of challenging me a little bit on like that, which I think is totally accurate, right? That what happens in the end, and even the and in part, like the ending for me is also one of those moments where we get we have both Tish and then we have Fawny working on the wood, and I'm always a little irritated in this novel with the moments that we have descriptions of things that Tish couldn't know. And, this is probably the least offensive of them, but I just always I have a difficult time kind of bringing those together, where, for instance, Mrs. Hunt's traveled to Puerto Rico, or Fawny, and things that he would never have told her, and yet somehow she knows it, or, so hopefully that responds, whatever else it does.
Thank you for that. It's a really important critique, and so I appreciate you bringing it into this conversation. Thanks again for being here. We're really glad that you took the time to be with us and to teach us about your reading of James Baldwin's work. And you have, for me, I'm thinking of I'd like to go back and review some of the other novels now and kind of look at that in time and out of time idea some more. For those of you who are watching via the live stream, and also for those of you on this call, you might be interested to know that on February 14th, Brian Blunt, the president of Union Presbyterian Seminary, will be with us. And that means that he will also be in our adult ed session at 9:15 on the 14th. But in preparation for that, next week, in our adult ed programming, we're going to review Blunt's really convicting and honest call that he made last year after the death of George Floyd regarding white witness. And so we're going to read it again. I will prepare some video clips of his commentary about witness when he visited here last summer. And then we're just going to kind of evaluate where are we at in our witness. So I encourage you to tune in via the live stream. There'll be an opportunity to jump into a Zoom room for a discussion after that video. And so look for that information on our calendar. You can contact me as well. So thank you all for being here. Megan, you can probably see a lot of grateful comments in the chat. So we really do appreciate your time. I am going to conclude now. I'll put up a slide about Blunt's visit next week, and we will mute this call until the live stream picks up the next programming. So thank you all.